a lot of international law has a character where you're looking at individual nation states as units, like that have their own personalities and are working things out. And the idea of putting a nation under sanctions is like offering a form of collective punishment to the group, hoping that it will provide a sort of incentive to change. One of the reasons we like sanctions is it's something that's fairly easy to apply relative to other kinds of means of putting pressure on governments. It's something that we can often do in multilateral ways, which create more international sorts of solutions for problems. And I think any full analysis of economic sanctions would have to look carefully at the very difficult to calculate weight that symbolic commitments play in structuring the international community. So one of the things we want in the international legal community is a set of willing participation in conventions which are not usually policed but nonetheless important, kind of shared ideas about how governments should work and about what the limitations are of legitimate uses of sovereignty. And it's very hard to, can't have just a big billboard on top of the world saying these are the rules we agree to. One of the things sanctions do is allow nations to get together and explain to other nations in the world the importance of these things and put pressure in places that make our shared understandings more meaningful. One argument that's made for sanctions is that they allow a non-violent, or at least non-directly violent, way of explaining these commitments and making them a meaningful source of incentives and disincentives in the world community. The case for sanctions depends on a complicated psychological theory about what the relationship is between people suffering economically within a nation and putting pressure on their governments to change over their system. And I think that's different people have slightly different views about how this works, but on the whole, I think people who favor sanctions tend to be overly optimistic about the relationship between civilian suffering and civilians placing direct pressure on their governments to respond in ways that's going to release them from these sanctions. When societies are placed in economic sanctions, it actually reduces their capacities to deal meaningfully with political oppression in their societies, partly because it's the most vulnerable who are often harmed, and the middle class economically is put under a lot of pressure, often by sanctions. And we know that there are strong ties between having a robust and flourishing middle class and having governments being held accountable for their actions to their own people. So sanctions might get in the way of that sometimes. My concern is with who takes responsibility for the harms of sanctions. So I think that sometimes we might be justified in using economic sanctions, but I think we should be careful about using them in a way that gets us off the hook for thinking seriously about the effects of those sanctions on civilian populations. So in the 1990s, Iraq was under a series of economic sanctions. And it's calculated that between 700,000 and 1 million people probably died as a result of hardships that can immediately be tied to those sanctions. That's a much higher number than the number of people who died in the first Gulf War, certainly. And yet we don't spend the same amount of critical attention or kind of public discussion on responsibilities for these more indirectly brought about deaths through sanctions. And I guess I would be happiest if, when we decide to employ sanctions, or when we're talking about whether they have been successful or not, we're careful to calculate those harms as ones that sanctioning bodies play a role in bringing about.